You've probably caught yourself daydreaming about sudden wealth, a lottery win, a business breakthrough, an unexpected inheritance. But have you ever considered that receiving vast wealth might be more of a curse than a blessing? Indeed, in the year 1877, the Vanderbilt heirs faced this very situation on an unimaginable scale. Nearly $3 billion in today's money, one of the largest fortunes in American history. And their response? Building palatial mansions, hosting legendary parties, living like European royalty, might even mirror exactly what you've imagined doing with sudden wealth. Yet, their story ends not in sustained luxury, but in one of history's most dramatic financial collapses. Thus, in today's episode, we'll trace their spectacular rise and fall, exploring how 3 generations of Vanderbilts transformed their grandfather's hard-won empire into a cautionary tale about wealth, legacy, and the price of luxury, as we describe the Vanderbilt heirs who lost $2.9 billion. On the morning of the 4th of December 1877, William Henry Vanderbilt woke up as the richest man in America. You see, his father, the Commodore, had left him a fortune of $95 million, equivalent to nearly $2.9 billion today. The marble halls of his Fifth Avenue mansion at 640 Fifth Avenue echoed with purpose, a monument to his family's meteoric rise from Staten Island ferry operators to railway titans. Unlike his father, who had clawed his way up from the shipping docks of New York Harbor, William Henry possessed a different kind of genius. Over the next 8 years, he would double the family fortune to nearly $200 million through shrewd railroad consolidations and market manipulations. Yet in this very success lay the seeds of destruction. His children were born into a world where wealth seemed as natural as air. They inherited not money, but a peculiar American birthright, the obligation to display their fortune in ways that would have made their grandfather, the Commodore, turn in his freshly dug grave. The Commodore had lived modestly in a simple brownstone. His grandchildren would build palaces. The transformation began with Cornelius Vanderbilt II, William Henry's eldest son. His mansion at First West 57th Street would become the largest private residence ever built in New York City, a monument to excess that occupied an entire city block. His brother, William Kissam Vanderbilt, not to be outdone, commissioned Richard Morris Hunt to design a limestone chateau that would make Fifth Avenue gasp. But it was the next generation that would truly test the limits of the Vanderbilt fortune. William Henry watched from his study as his grandchildren's ambitions expanded beyond even New York's gilded boundaries. While the Commodore had invested in infrastructure that built America, his great-grandchildren would invest in European art, French furniture, and Italian marble, assets that generated nothing but awe. The numbers told a story that kept William Henry awake at night. Each mansion required a staff of at least 25 servants. The annual operating costs alone could have funded a small railroad. Yet these expenses paled in comparison to the society obligations, the yachts, the thoroughbred stables, and the endless pursuit of social supremacy. In his final years, William Henry sensed a change coming to America, a transformation that would require more than just vast wealth to navigate. The political winds were shifting against the great monopolies his father had built. Popular opinion was turning against displays of excessive wealth, and his heirs, raised in unprecedented luxury, seemed blind to these gathering storms. As William Henry's life drew to a close in 1885, the Vanderbilt fortune stood at its apex. But beneath the glittering surface of America's greatest fortune, cracks were beginning to form. The next generation of Vanderbilts was about to learn a harsh lesson about wealth. Creating it was one thing. Keeping it would prove to be something else entirely. In 1883, when Cornelius Vanderbilt II first opened the doors to his new mansion at First West 57th Street, the scale of Vanderbilt ambition reached its architectural apex. The house stretched an entire city block, requiring a small army of servants to maintain. The grand hall gleamed with rare Italian marble, each piece selected and imported at staggering expense. But more telling than the mansion's size was its purpose. It existed not to shelter or comfort, but to announce. The family's determination to display their wealth transformed Fifth Avenue into a procession of limestone palaces. Each new mansion aimed to eclipse its predecessors, turning New York's most fashionable street into a battlefield of architectural one-upmanship. Tourists gathered daily outside their homes, turning the family's private lives into public theatre. The Vanderbilts responded to this scrutiny not by retreating, but by building ever more impressive monuments to their wealth. Meanwhile, the railroad empire that generated this fortune faced mounting challenges. New government regulations threatened their monopolies. Labor unions challenged their authority. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 specifically targeted the railroad industry's pricing practices. But in the rarefied air of Newport and Fifth Avenue, such concerns seemed distant and irrelevant. Each member of the third generation seemed determined to outdo the others. While Cornelius II reigned over Fifth Avenue, his younger brother George was secretly planning something even more ambitious. In the mountains of North Carolina, he would build Biltmore, a chateau so vast it would make his siblings' homes look modest by comparison. The construction costs would strain even the massive Vanderbilt fortune. Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, Cornelius II's son, exemplified the third generation's departure from their grandfather's business priorities. While the Commodore had devoted his life to building his railway empire, Alfred poured millions into Sagamore Farms, developing one of America's premier horse breeding operations. The contrast between generations could not have been starker. The Commodore had seen every dollar as a tool for building more wealth. His great-grandchildren saw money as a means to escape the very business that had created it. They became collectors, sportsmen, and socialites, everything except the hard-driving businessmen who had built the family fortune. By the 1890s, the annual operating costs of the various Vanderbilt properties had grown astronomical. Each mansion required an army of servants. Each horse farm demanded constant investment. Each yacht needed a full crew year-round. But more dangerous than these visible expenses was an invisible shift taking place in American business. One that would test whether the Vanderbilt's railway empire could survive without the ruthless focus of its founders. As the century drew to a close, J.P. Morgan, already the most powerful banker in America, was restructuring the railroad industry. His vision for America's railroads had nothing to do with family dynasties or marble mansions, and in his methodical consolidation of power, he was about to teach the Vanderbilts a lesson about wealth that would echo through generations. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the first cracks in the Vanderbilt financial edifice began to show. The family's vast network of railroads, once the undisputed titan of American transportation, faced unprecedented challenges. Standard Oil and other industrial giants now commanded the freight rates that the Vanderbilts had once dictated. The monopolistic practices that had built their fortune were under assault from President Theodore Roosevelt's trust-busting campaign. But in the grand salons of Fifth Avenue, a more immediate crisis was unfolding. The third generation of Vanderbilts had mastered the art of spending wealth, but not of generating it. Each year, the maintenance costs of their estates consumed more of the family's capital. Biltmore alone required hundreds of thousands of dollars annually just to keep its doors open. The Newport cottages swallowed fortunes in upkeep, their massive staff payrolls matching those of small factories. Cornelius Vanderbilt III, known as Neely, provided perhaps the most telling example of the family's transformation. Despite inheriting the business acumen that had characterized his grandfather, he found himself largely disinherited by his father Cornelius II, who disapproved of his marriage to Grace Wilson. His portion of the inheritance, $1.5 million compared to his siblings' dozens of millions, marked the first public rupture in the family's unified facade. The family's grip on their railroad empire had been slowly loosening since the 1890s. J.P. Morgan's growing influence in the industry gradually pushed the Vanderbilts to the periphery of the business they had once dominated. The family that had once dictated terms to Wall Street now found themselves increasingly dependent on the banking establishment's goodwill. The most revealing shift came in how the fourth generation viewed the source of their wealth. While the Commodore had spent his days poring over shipping manifests and railway timetables, his great-great-grandchildren rarely set foot in a railroad office. They inherited shares but not stewardship, wealth but not the weight of responsibility that had accompanied it. William K. Vanderbilt II embodied this evolving identity. Though he maintained some involvement in the family's railroad interests, his true passion lay in scientific pursuit. His oceanographic expeditions, while intellectually valuable, represented a dramatic departure from the profit-focused ventures that had built the family fortune. In 1913, a new threat emerged: the federal income tax. The Vanderbilts, like many of America's wealthiest families, had never structured their holdings to withstand systematic taxation. Their vast properties, designed to display wealth rather than generate it, would soon become magnificent liabilities. But even as their financial power ebbed, none of the Vanderbilts could have predicted the devastating blow that awaited them. A blow that would come not from government regulation or business competition, but from an entirely unexpected quarter. The 1920s marked not a sudden collapse, but the acceleration of a decline decades in the making. Even before the Great Depression, the signs of the Vanderbilts' waning fortune were impossible to ignore. In 1926, the most visible symbol of this transformation occurred when the magnificent Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion at 57th Street and 5th Avenue, perhaps the greatest private residence ever built in America, was sold for $7 million to make way for Bergdorf Goodman. The forces dismantling the Vanderbilt fortune were more complex than any single market crash or economic downturn. The rise of income tax and inheritance tax steadily eroded their capital. The explosive growth in the number of heirs meant the fortune was split into ever smaller portions. Each generation's lifestyle expectations remained aristocratic, even as their individual shares of the family wealth diminished. The railroad empire that had generated their wealth faced fundamental challenges. The rise of automobiles transformed American transportation. New regulations cut into profits. The interstate highway system would soon make passenger rail travel increasingly obsolete. The Vanderbilts' influence over the New York Central Railroad, once the crown jewel of their grandfather's empire, continued to wane. Their vast estates, designed for a different era, became increasingly unsustainable. Property taxes rose while income from investments declined. The armies of servants required to maintain these properties represented expenses that couldn't be justified as the family's circumstances changed. Fine furniture, rare paintings, and precious artifacts that had been collected at enormous expense were gradually sold off, often at fractions of their purchase prices. The fourth generation of Vanderbilts faced a transformation their ancestors could never have imagined. The nature of American wealth itself was changing. The era of railroad barons and robber barons was giving way to a new kind of capitalism. Family dynasties were being replaced by corporate structures. Personal empires were yielding to shareholder ownership. Some members of the family adapted to these changes better than others. Several pursued careers in journalism, arts, and other professions, a marked departure from their ancestors' focus on empire building. Others continued to live on inherited wealth, watching it slowly diminish with each passing year. The Great Depression, when it came, merely intensified pressures that were already reshaping the family's position in American society. The Vanderbilt story became a cautionary tale of American wealth, not because their fortune vanished overnight in the crash of 1929, but because it dissolved slowly over decades through a combination of taxes, division among heirs, changing economic conditions, and the mounting costs of maintaining a lifestyle that belonged to another century. Yet even as the physical emblems of their wealth disappeared, the Vanderbilts were about to demonstrate that a family's true legacy isn't measured in mansions or millions. The final chapter of the Vanderbilt Railroad empire came in 1968, when the New York Central Railroad merged with its longtime rival, the Pennsylvania Railroad. It was a union born of desperation. Penn Central would declare bankruptcy by 1970, marking the definitive end of the railroad dynasty the Commodore had built a century earlier. The numbers tell a shocking story. In 1877, William Henry Vanderbilt inherited $95 million, which through shrewd business acumen, he increased to $232 million before his death in 1885. If that fortune had simply kept pace with inflation and remained intact, it would be worth billions today. Instead, it evaporated through a combination of inheritance taxes, maintenance costs, and a fatal disconnect between wealth creation and wealth preservation. The mansions that once lined Fifth Avenue exist now only in photographs. The Breakers in Newport stands as an icon of the family's former glory. though until 2018, the family still maintained private use of the third floor as a summer residence, even as tourists filed through the floors below. Biltmore, though still privately owned by Vanderbilt descendants, operates as a commercial enterprise. Its grounds, reduced from the original 125,000 acres to approximately 8,000, now support hotels, restaurants, and a winery necessary to maintain the estate's vast operating costs. The heirs who squandered the fortune weren't villains. They were products of their time and upbringing. The same social pressures that drove them to build palatial homes also prevented them from adapting to changing economic realities. Their tragedy wasn't that they spent lavishly. It was that they lost the capacity to generate wealth that had distinguished their forebears. The Commodore had started with nothing, building his fortune through a relentless focus on business fundamentals. William Henry had more than doubled the family wealth through shrewd management of existing assets. But their descendants faced a paradox. They had been raised to be aristocrats in a country founded in opposition to aristocracy. They had inherited wealth, but not the hunger that created it. The final irony of the Vanderbilt fortune lies in what survived its dissolution. While the family's financial empire crumbled, the institutions they endowed flourished. Vanderbilt University, founded by the Commodore's initial $1 million gift, equivalent to $29 million today, grew into one of America's premier educational institutions. The family's architectural legacy, though diminished, helped establish the preservation movement in American cities. Today, the Vanderbilt name still carries weight, but it's no longer synonymous with unimaginable wealth. Instead, it serves as a reminder that fortunes, no matter how vast, are not self-perpetuating. Each generation must either build upon its inheritance or watch it slowly slip away. And now, we'd love to see you in the comments. What is your opinion on the Vanderbilt legacy? Is it one that should be admired, or one that should be studied as a lesson on what not to do? We thrive off of your thoughts, so leave a couple sentences below, and we'll look forward to hearing from you. Thanks again for joining us for another episode of Old Money Luxury, and cheers until next time.